Bullshit.
It's the 10-year anniversary of the No Bullshit Marketing Show. Wait, that can't be right, can it? Yes, it's the 10-year anniversary of the No Bullshit Marketing Show. I'm Dave Mastovich. Back in August of 2015, the show began. Today, I'm going to walk you through the history of the why behind starting the podcast, some of the cool stories that happened over the years, where we are today with the podcast, and where we're going. So it began actually in 2009 or 2010 when I thought this vehicle that's out there, this podcast thing, is something that could help tell stories. So I took a look at it, researched it, actually bought some equipment. And I talk a lot about predictive index. So my predictive index is that I push for creative ideas, I push for the vision, but I also can be gas pedal then brake pedal. And so those that are around me know that sometimes I get all excited about an idea, then I kind of halt it for a while. Well, I did that with the podcast for about 4 years. Looked into it, bought equipment, thought it was time, then said, nah, I don't think it's time. So then around 2015, I saw Podcaster's Paradise, this program by John Lee Dumas. And he had started doing a podcast every day, interviewing someone. It was impressive back when hardly anyone was doing podcasts. And he built a system, and then he monetized it by telling everybody else how to use that system. So I studied that system, got it in place, and said, we're going to have our podcast checklists, and let's go and decide to do it. Why? Well, I thought it was a great way to tell stories about leadership and communication through marketing and storytelling. I thought that there's all kinds of stories out there to be told from hugely successful people at the peak of their careers, strong at what they do, having success in multiple parts of their lives, but they're really only known in their space or their region and their industry. And I thought those stories can help others. So it wasn't to go out and get famous people to be interviewed, and it wasn't to go out and do a cross-promotion thing, which is what ended up happening about 3 to 5 years after I started the No Bullshit Marketing Show. Podcasting became this thing where I'll have you as a guest and you have me as a guest, and then I'll go on her show and she'll go on mine, and it was all this branding thing. That's okay. I think that's okay. I think it can be a good branding thing, and I'll gladly be a guest on any show. But my intention with the show at the beginning and today was always to tell stories, and stories about how to lead and how to communicate. And if you're going to do marketing, to do it with the science and the math driving the creative art. So I set out to start doing this show, and I remember going to my CEO mastermind group and talking about podcasts, and I actually had to put together a deck to explain what they were. That's not that long ago, but that's how it was 10 years ago. And I had to explain that this is something you can do while working out, while walking, while cooking, while driving. You can listen to a podcast. I said it was audio on demand. And there was a glazed over look by half the room, and then a third of the room was like, not sure, and a couple of people said, I kind of get it. So that was one of the first issues. And then the second issue became, I would say this show's about leadership and communication. And then people would go, but you're saying it's the No Bullshit Marketing Show. And I'd say, well, that's part of the reason I'm doing it. Real marketing is about leadership and communication, and marketing and storytelling, driving that leadership and communication. I knew then, and I still know now, that that's not how it's perceived by most. Most people don't really have a good understanding of marketing, even people that work in the space. And there aren't a lot of great leaders in the world. There are hardly even any good managers. So I knew I was up against it. I was talking about leadership and communication through marketing and storytelling. And I knew those things weren't going to make me popular. They're not something you get excited about. They're not universal. So I knew it was going to be a niche show from the beginning. But I set out to do it, and the third thing would happen when I started as a guest format at the beginning, and I would talk to people that I would reach out to that I had either knew or observed or was connected with that fit that profile that I said. They were really strong at what they do. They led and built and grew teams and companies, and they were known as an expert by some, but their life story could help everyone. I've gotten to talk to them, and many of them that knew me would say, I was really nervous when you talked to me about that. And I'd say, why? Well, first you said leadership and communication. I didn't quite get it. And secondly, I was worried what you'd ask. And I said, well, I sent you 4 open-ended questions that I was going to ask, and the first one takes 15 to 20 minutes. The first one was just tell me your story of how you got to where you are today. And there were 3 other questions. What's one tool you use? What's one thing, advice you give? Things like that. But because of my bluntness and my reputation as a maverick that pushes the envelope and direct person, there was a fear that the guests thought I was going to put them on the spot, and that wasn't at all the case. I knew from my career that the reason I succeeded in media and in marketing and as a coach in sports, I felt I understood how to relate to people and ask a lot of questions and listen. I make listening a big piece of my practice of life, anything in life. So that's part of why I felt that I was made to do something like a podcast, because I had a lot of media experience, a lot of experience listening, a lot of experience asking questions. So that's what it started out, where there was fear from the guests that they weren't sure what I was going to do. Then we had to start thinking about getting the podcast going. One of the coolest things about the podcast I can't really take credit for was I asked a friend and a colleague, Suzanne Mayer and Dave Jennings, 2 people that I've worked with for years. I said, I'd like to make the open a little bit different. I don't want to hear just, inspirational, a little bit of sound music, a little bit of do-do-do-do-do type music at the beginning. I said, I want something irreverent. And if you listen to this show, which you are, if you're listening now, you know the beginning has that bullshit. That was created by Dave Jennings through Suzanne reaching out and providing some creative direction. So I want to thank both of them. But right from the start, we had that. Despite having all those policies and procedures and checklists and purchasing quality equipment, we had so many weird tech problems that we began to joke, #jinx is real, because we felt we were jinxed. Anything that could happen would happen. And whether it was something with the audio, something with the recording, something with the playback, something with anything that you could imagine, we ran into these tech problems. So we called it #jinx is real. That combined with the guests being nervous led to a lot of stress around what shouldn't have been the stress. Normally the stress is, who's going to be the guest? What are we going to say? How are we going to handle it while it's recording? That actually comes pretty natural to me. And because of my life experiences, that doesn't probably come as natural to others. The tech stuff doesn't seem to happen to anybody else. I talk to them, they laugh at me. So whether #jinx is real is correct, or whether me and Mike Gaddy and Suzanne and Marcel and Maria and all those people that have been involved in it, maybe we just are making mistakes. But that's the beginning. So it began with, let's do a guest format. And we saw that the guest shows were really going well. The guest would pour out their heart and they would talk for almost an hour. So we said, let's chop that into 2 episodes. So every guest was 2 episodes, and we did 1 a week for something like the first 60, 70 weeks. And in the first 2 years, out of 100 weeks, we probably had 80 guests, 75, 80 guests. Some of the more memorable ones, we had people like Shep Hyken, one of the top customer experience gurus in the world. And he's been on multiple times, and he would come on and just talk about his best-selling books and talk about his keynotes that he was doing all across the country. Very, very valuable for our audience. We also had Chris Broadman, a friend of mine who is a successful merger and acquisition attorney that is also the managing partner for the law firm Metz-Lewis-Broadman. And Chris and I had a lot of fun. We clicked, we're friends, but he said something that ended up being one of the most attractive things to our audience. He talked about his undergraduate college and said he was just above average. He wasn't even a B student. And all of a sudden, all these people started emailing us and texting us and posting things about how they too had a 2.3 or a 2.5 and they felt they made it too. So it was about being vulnerable to help others and asking open-ended questions and listening. I also was fortunate that at the beginning of the show, one of my first ever mentor was a guy that I worked at in radio when I was 16 years old and ended up working with him side by side for a number of years. And his name's David Smith, and he has a company called Sound Testimony, and he's one of the top audio people in the country as far as for legal cases when there's any kind of audio. That there's the famous one was when Robert Blake, the star from the show Beretta, had a recording that said something they couldn't quite make it out. They gave it to paid Dave to make that so the audio was clear. Well, Dave said, I want to help out. So I had, at the beginning of the show, probably the first 50 to 75 episodes, I had this sound engineer making sure the audio in those first shows was so tight. We weren't worthy of the audio of those first shows. So I got to work with a guy like that who's a big part of my life. Then from the beginning, I decided I wanted to have my brother Mike on the first show. Well, the other day I was listening to Tim Ferriss, and he had a replay of his episode 1. He was joking about how much it had changed. And it still was Tim Ferriss. It still was a very good episode. And I think our first episode was still good. But when you listen to the first episode and then you listen to the 10th and the 50th, you see how much more comfortable we get. So my brother and I were kind of muddling through it in that episode 1 back in August of 2015. But that was a cool thing to have my brother on because of his background as a sports Hall of Fame writer, but also his work with Mass Solutions and being a part of my life. And he's also another person that loves pop culture. Then 2 other mentors and former bosses of mine, George Hartnett and Tony Lombardi, ended up being on the show, which was really just great to hear them on the show because they reverted right back to their roles and they started giving me advice on the show, and it was just great. Then we also had Alec, Brevin, and Carter, my sons, were on multiple ones. We tended to do a key episode, like the 100th episode, the 200th episode. But there's one when Carter is on by himself when he's 10 or 11 years old. He's got this raspy voice, and he's got that youthful excitement for being on, and that's a memorable one too. I've had people like Tom Rodriguez on the show a couple of times, a good friend, and we would talk basketball. In fact, we did a breakdown on some basketball analysis and the storytelling behind that. And just had a number of fantastic guests over the years that brought a lot of value to me personally, but also to the audience. Now, the evolution of the show is that it began as purely a guest show, and then it morphed into whenever something would happen, David Bowie passes away, things of that nature, we would do a special episode. And we started to get feedback that the people that were listening really, really liked the Thought Leader solo episodes. So we moved away from guests for a while and did a lot of those. Then, when we hit our 20th anniversary, we spent a lot of time talking about the company's 20th anniversary. That was followed by the release of my new book, No Bullshit Marketing. So now 2025 has been focused on no bullshit marketing and now the 10-year anniversary. The plan is to take the next level of go back to some guest series and have like seasons where we pick a topic, say healthcare marketing, and we get a season of 6 to 8 guests and create those episodes. Then we move into another season that's maybe about family-owned businesses and we get 6 to 8 guests that way. Another one might be about professional services firms and how they lead and market, and we'll get that season. So that's where our evolution is going and where it's going to continue to move. And it's going to be continually be about leadership, communication, marketing, and storytelling, and how that makes an impact on people personally, professionally, and on companies' top and bottom lines, and also on employee recruitment and retention through what we call BTE, business to employee marketing. So the lessons that learned over the course of doing this was a couple of things. From background of traditional media, spent way too much time worried about how perfect it sounded or how perfect it looked, because after the first 5 years we jumped in and started doing video. This is something people don't realize. Back in 2015, there weren't as many podcasts, and 99% of them were done just audio only. So around 2019 or 20, we added video to the piece. As we go farther along, we've learned and realized and evolved and said, hey, it doesn't matter so much how perfect it looks or how much you make mistakes or whatever like that. And that's something that had to be learned because we were trained in my generation for a whole different type of traditional media. So that's one of the lessons learned. The other lesson learned was to really focus on being as flexible as possible and moving from possibly a guest show to a thought leader type show, not worrying about the length, not worrying about, sometimes it's a little longer, sometimes a little bit less. I'd be remiss if I also didn't talk about the behind the scenes work to make the podcast happen from the beginning all the way through to today. From the beginning, Mike Gaddy was involved. He and I love to research things. So when we first decided we were going to do a podcast, sat down, researched it, looked into it, did the Podcaster's Paradise, studied that. And Mike then helped get the podcast up and running. He also was the host to interview me on a milestone episode. Then he also interviewed my sons and some clients and everything. So he was involved a lot there. Maria Marhefka was involved and did a fantastic job of driving the content for the podcast and promoting it on social media. And she also interviewed me for episode 350. I mentioned Suzanne Mayer. She jumped in and ended up being a co-host with me and had one of my favorite episodes and interviews was we interviewed Mark Falone, an old colleague and friend. And that's when we realized that we just got to let things happen because we just were laughing and joking the whole time. And we were worried it was going to make the podcast unprofessional. And it made the episodes with Mark Falone that much more fun and engaging. So thank you also to Suzanne. And then Marcel McCaskill was a video person on the case for a couple of years and really brought a whole new element, a whole new look at it. So thank you to Marcel. And of course, my brother Mike has been on multiple shows and been interviewed and continues to play a role in the content. So that's the behind the scenes look and the thank yous to everybody. So it's been 10 years of having a podcast. When we started in 2010, thought about it, hardly anyone had a podcast. In 2015, it was starting to become more common, but not a lot of them. Today, there's probably too many of them, but it is still a valuable medium, and I still want to talk about leadership and communication and how marketing and storytelling can drive both, and I still want to cut the bullshit. So we're at 10 years, and I'm looking forward to talking to you 10 years from now, saying we're having a 20th anniversary of the podcast. I'm going to end it the way we ended the first couple hundred. Bold solutions, no BS. Talk more soon.
Bullshit.